Okay, so this is part 2 of the question 5 of paper 1 explanation. Now, as I explained in the previous video, you have 2 choices for question 5. And it's very important you pick the right one, which is going to enable you to play to whatever your strengths are going to be. And you'll know by the time you go in the exam which one you prefer of the 2. So you have either narrative, which is essentially a story, or you have a descriptive option, which is something considerably different to a story. Let's start here with narrative. Talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you should be bearing in mind if you're going to choose the narrative option of the 2. Now, before I do start, I want to preface this by saying that for descriptive and narrative, accuracy is of equal importance. So regardless of which one you choose, you've got to ensure, as I said in the previous video, that your SPAG, spelling, punctuation and grammar, is as accurate as you can make it, and also that your vocabulary, if possible, is varied and effective. But beyond that, there are significant differences between the 2. Now, quite often people will think, well, I'm going to pick a story. Story is easier, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Some people have a flair for storytelling. Other people find it a little bit more difficult. Doesn't mean that anybody can't do it, but it's very important to bear a few things in mind if you are going to write a story. How you structure that story is very important. So the first thing I would say to remember is structure. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can tell a story. Think about films that you've seen. Sometimes a film will be told in a linear fashion, meaning that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's the standard, traditional way of telling a story, and you can choose to structure your story that way if you wish. However, sometimes it's good to do what is called thinking outside the box. What does that mean? Well, that means trying to be original, trying to not be predictable. So yeah, your story can have a beginning, a middle, and end, but maybe you start with the end. Maybe the middle is at the beginning is in the middle, and the end still remains at the end, but you can fracture your narrative, break it up if necessary. It's a good way of creating cliffhangers. So when you're thinking about your structure and you want to engage your audience, very, very important to engage the reader, perhaps you do it that way. Start with an event, and then the rest of the story is explaining how that event came to pass. Or stick with the traditional way, but just make sure that you're thinking about that. And that's something you can decide in the planning section. So structure, first thing to consider. Next thing to consider, language. Now, language features, you will have done a considerable amount of work on those in class. Using language to create atmosphere, to create tension, to develop your characters. All very important things. So all those things that you've practiced and you've learned in class, this is a chance to apply those and to augment, to enhance, to make your writing more powerful, to make it more effective. So thinking about the language and the structure. Characters. Now, if I'm reading a story, and I'm sure most people would agree with this, if I don't engage with the characters, it's very, very difficult to care about the story. Have you ever watched a film where you don't like any characters and the characters don't seem believable? Well, why are you going to care what happens to them if they don't feel believable, if you don't care about them, if you're not engaging with them? So developing your character or characters is very, very important. Think about what they look like. Describe them. Describe the way they react to things. Go into detail if you can. Describe the way other characters react to them. We as readers are going to learn a lot about your characters if we understand the way that your characters interact with one another. So think about all of those things. Make your characters believable, give them depth, give them personalities. Make your reader care about them so that it makes your story engaging. So I would say those are the 3 main things to consider if you choose the narrative option. Structure, how you're putting the story together. Are you going to tell it in the traditional way, or are you going to fracture it, break it up? Language, how are you going to use vocabulary, language features to make your story more exciting, to create imagery? And characters, make your characters believable. Make your characters relatable. Have your characters behaving in a way that your readers are going to understand. And if you do those things, you should be well on your way to getting as many marks out of 40 as you can. Okay, so option number 2, descriptive writing. Now, very often people make the mistake of thinking that descriptive writing is telling a story. It is not telling a story. Categorically, it's not. And if you do choose this option, and by all means choose it if you feel that you have a better chance of scoring highly doing it, you must remember you are not telling a story. If you want to tell a story, choose the narrative option. The descriptive option is all about the senses. It's important that you bear that in mind. I always say, if you're going to pick the descriptive option, imagine that the scene that you are describing is taking place over a few seconds. If you're writing a narrative piece, a story, it can be over weeks, it can be months, years even. But if you are writing descriptively, I would always recommend that you imagine you're in the scenario, you're looking from left to right or right to left, and you're just describing the experience. Think about the senses and imagine it's taking place over a few seconds. Why? Because if it's taking place over a few seconds, it's much more difficult then to accidentally go into storytelling, because there isn't actually a story taking place. Left to right, so what are you seeing? What can you hear? What can you smell? What can you taste? And importantly, what's the emotional experience of these things? You don't have to have every sentence in a piece of descriptive writing focusing on the sense. The emotion, the inner voice is part of it too. Describing what you or your character, if it's a character, is experiencing emotionally. So it's not just the physical senses, not just the tangible, not just what's going on outside, externally, it's also inside the mind. There's a lot of territory to explore. So as well as the senses, I would say emotions, an important element to remember. Okay. Avoid discourse markers. What does that mean? Well, avoid things like and then. Don't need to keep saying and then and after that. In fact, don't say that at all, because that's how you tell a story. If you are writing descriptively, it is literally just a series of descriptive sentences. Sure, there should be some kind of structure. It needs to be coherent and it needs to make sense, but it's not, and then I did this, and then I did that. No, that's a story. Descriptive is all about just the experience and a collection of sentences, still in paragraphs, I should add, that describe that experience in detail. So avoid and then, and phrases like that. Language, very, 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 very important when it comes to writing descriptively. So, for example, similes, metaphors, things like that are absolutely crucial to use when you're writing descriptively. Why would you use those? Why not just describe a blue sky as a blue sky? Well, you can. But if you are going to use similes and metaphors, what you are essentially doing, if you use them correctly, and I'm going to do another video on how to use those correctly, but if you use them correctly, you should be able to create imagery in the mind of your reader that goes beyond the basic description, that creates powerful imagery that perhaps could only exist in a dream. But that's kind of the point of descriptive writing. You want people to imagine when they're reading it that they're there, but also you want their imagination almost to go beyond the experience. And using the correct language features, the correct vocabulary, the right wording will help to create that imagery in the mind of the person reading it.